Welcome to the Introduction to Python and Matrices course. In this lecture, we will be specifically focusing on Introduction to Python, where we will give you some basic ideas and concepts related in Python programming languages. Before I go further, it's very essential for me to convey that programming is an essential part of learning any data science and machine learning concept. Whatever you learn theoretically, you do need to implement them in a programming framework so that you can get benefit out of it. And that's why learning a programming language that allows you to basically use the concept that you have learned in data science, machine learning, or deep learning courses is very, very useful. And in that context, one of the most popular programming frameworks that are used for doing data science and machine learning techniques is Python. Python has multiple features and has emerged as a leader in programming languages for data science, machine learning, and deep learning applications. And there are various reasons for that. First, it's an easy language compared to other languages for you to learn. It's easily readable. It's dynamically typed language, and I will explain this concept in a little bit, where you do not need to declare the type of variables and so on. It automatically understands the different types of variables that you're trying to declare, and it allows you for easy programming. Obviously, it has also embedded the object-oriented concepts, which are very, very important in programming languages, and Python allows for you to do object-oriented programming too. It is a very popular specifically in data science and machine learning, and it does have a large community supports, and there are different packages from the Python that you can use inbuilt in your programming framework, where people have contributed a large scale code that you can use for your own purposes. And again, one of the most important things that it's open source. You do not need to, essentially pay for you to use Python programming. And then there are standard libraries, multiple of them that people can use for their own programming frameworks. And this is essentially causing Python to be a leader in data science, machine learning community in particular. There are various other languages that you can use for programming purposes with respect to the data science and machine learning concept, and they're also good. But typically, Python will be considered the leader in the field of data science and machine learning, and that's why we are focusing on developing some basic concepts and intuitions involved in the Python programming framework. I hope you will learn from the concept that we have provided in this lecture, and then that will allow you to build upon this to develop your own data science and machine learning codes. So let's get started with some concepts in Python. Before I go into the Python, I want to mention that I will leave this notebook for your reference, Python notebook for your reference that you can go through. And secondly, that I'm using essentially Google Colab. So I have uploaded my notebook to Google Drive, and then I have opened this Python notebook in Google Colab, which basically takes care of execution and everything else. So it's very, very easy for you to test out the functionality of the code that you have created on Google Colab. So I will encourage you to use that, and that's what I'm using for demoing this lecture. So let's get into some basic essentials and different concepts that are involved in Python programming languages. Okay, so let's begin with this idea that how does Python takes into account variables and different types. One of the things that I have mentioned is that Python typically is not statically typed. It's basically a dynamically typed. It automatically recognizes the different types of variables that you might have. Okay, so let's get started. So what I'm doing here is, let's say if you are programming and if you have to declare a variable, right? What you can do is, rather than declaring int x, which is like how you do in traditional programming, statically typed programming, you can directly assign a value of integer x equal to 1, which is listed here in right here in the first line of the code that you see, and that itself automatically assumes, that x is an integer value. Okay, and you can run this code and you can see that x came out to be 1. If you print out, the type of x, you will see the bottom right here that the type of variable x is int, which is automatically recognized by the Python programming language. And same thing you can do with other aspects where you can define a float. So you see the code y equal to 0.1. This is how you can declare, essentially and assign directly a variable which takes in the float values. You can run this codes and you can see, the type. So you can see the type for y is essentially float. So the, it has been dynamically recognized by the Python that y is a float variable. You can do different conversion in, the programming languages. So you can convert integer to float using a command here. So we have done float x, and remember x was an integer. By doing this, function or calling this function float, we have been able to convert float into an integer variable. Okay, we can also do the same thing. We can take a float variable and we can convert that in integer, and that's what we are doing here. So we have int y, and it automatically has been reduced to the closest integer, which is 0. Okay, similarly you can take a variable y equal to 0.6, which is a float variable, and convert that into an int using this command int y, and that's why you will see that came out to be 0. So there is a flexibility. You can declare things, and then if needed you can convert into different types of variables that you are interested in creating. So let's go through some simple exercises. Suppose you have two variables a and b which are integers, right? What will be the type of a plus b? And that is also dynamically determined by the Python. So a and b here are two variables which are integer, but if you sum them up, automatically the Python recognizes that also to be an integer variable. Okay. Let's run some other operations. So if we are performing a times b, which is a multiplied by b, in that case also the Python recognizes that this is essentially a integer variable. So that's what you see. Class int is the type of the variable a times b is, and so automatically Python is recognizing that a multiplied by b is also an integer. Now let's carry out a interesting, if we divide this, right, a by b. So a by b by division will convert into a float. So again, everything has been dynamically recognized by the Python language, and you do not need to specify the type of variable, which is a requirement in some of the programming languages that are out there. Now we have discussed about how to declare variables like integer, floats, and so on. Let's move on to declaring string variables, which are also very, very important in any programming languages, right? And so there are a couple of ways to define it. You can define a string with a single quote, or you can define a string with double quotes, right? And here you can see I have a variable s, which was allocated to single quote hello, and then we have s1 which was allocated to double quote word. Okay, and we can print this variables, and once we print these variables you can see the output is hello and hello that you can see here. And there are slight differences between using the double quotes and the single quote, because the double quotes allows you to include the apostrophes where these numbers would terminate if the strings would use the single quote. So there is slight nuances that you need to understand between double quote users and single quote users. So let's continue that discussion further. So if I define a string with the content don't, right, and if I print that out we will get don't. Okay, and that's what you're seeing in the bottom right here, where we are printing out essentially the don't variable.